on down here, I have a question for all of you to contextualize this next part. How many of you folks have heard of, read, or watched Last of the Mohicans before? Okay, for those folks raising your hands, I assume you're talking about the 1992 Daniel Day-Lewis version, not the Italian cartoon, or the Hanna-Barbera version. Did you know the studio that made Scooby-Doo made their own version of it? There's like 11 different versions, right? It's terrible. It's free on YouTube though. But they actually do the, you know, the Scooby-Doo like spinning room thing? It's like Alice and Cora running through the, it's a bit corny when you do it like that, right? But going back to the Daniel Day one, the most famous iteration, right? Do you guys remember about halfway through the movie, Daniel Day, the two ladies, and his adopted father and brother, Chingachgook and Uncas, are sneaking into a fort in the middle of the night that's actively under attack? I'm sure you know where I'm going with it. Yes, exactly, right? That fort you see is this fort. But it's not literally this fort in the movie. You probably already knew this too. But they actually made a reconstruction of Fort William Henry in North Carolina. But in a very historically accurate way, when they were done filming at this replica of the fort, they burnt it to the ground. And guess what happens here?
Same thing.
Well, exactly. People are always a bit shocked when I say that, right? Because that begs the question that, well, wait, if the fort was burnt to the ground, what's all this? We'll circle back to that, right? Now, to truly segue into this next part, I have to ask you folks a follow-up question. Now, we already established at the beginning, what's the most important thing in warfare? Resources, right? We established that. So my follow-up question is, folks, what are the most important resources, or what is the most important?
Land.
Who said land? What do you get off of the land?
More space to do stuff.
Just space?
Advantage.
What?
Advantage.
In terms of what?
Firing.
Wow, we're going back to the military. Think more basic.
Water.
Wait, water and? Yes! See, it's always the caretakers, the mothers that get this right? Food and, yeah, because again, land is great, but that's what I was trying to get you to say. What do you do on the land? You plant... You plant crops that you can harvest, so you have animals, right? Now, to that end, guess what Quebec is running out of in 1756 and 57? Food. Well, they had plenty of water, it's just frozen most of the year, right? But food, they're in the middle of a famine. Now, this is not good because, of course, you can't really, if you have no food to feed your soldiers, you can't wage a war. This is also not lost on King Louis XV in France, who comes up with the brilliant idea of like, well, okay, there's a famine in North America. He goes, I will send over my best general from the fields of Europe to speed up the war so we win before we run out of food. That's literally the French plan. Not bad, I guess, given that they've had a slew of victories, but it is a little bit of a precarious plan, right? Now, the guy that Louis XV sends over has a very long name. Would you like to hear the whole thing? Of course you would, right? Good that some of you are sitting down, right? His name is Louis-Joseph le Marquis de Montcalm Granson de Saint-Véran. If you've seen Last of the Mohicans, they just refer to him as Montcalm, or if you want to be slightly fancy, the Marquis de Montcalm, right? Now, Montcalm, in 1757, finds himself stationed in the backwater fort of Ticonderoga. But he's not going to let that get him down, and unlike Dieskau, he's got fairly ambitious plans, right? His plan is in the spring. He wants to take 10,000 men, and he wants to march south, and he wants to besiege this fort for just 2 days. Seems fast, right? Once he's done with this fort, he wants to proceed to Fort Edward, and he wants to besiege that fort for just 2 days. This plan seems a little, strained, a little fast, right? Why does he want to besiege these backwater forts so quickly? Well, exactly that. They're backwater forts. He doesn't want to waste his time with these. He wants to waste his time, per se, on the prize, which is New York State's capital. Albany, exactly, right? Now, Albany back then was like an old Dutch fortified city, so he knows that that's going to take some time, and he wants to make sure that he has enough resources to do it. But even Albany isn't his ultimate goal. His ultimate goal is a much bigger city, a bit further south along the Hudson River. New York City. Now, if you know do I have any American Revolutionary War nerds in the audience? Yeah, I knew that. I was like, if anyone has studied this before, or if you've just seen Hamilton, right? This plan that Montcalm has is very similar, practically identical to the Saratoga campaign in 1778.
And Plattsburgh later.
What was that?
And Plattsburgh later.
Correct. Well, yeah, when they come in multiple angles, right? But generally speaking, Burgoyne is supposed to come south from Quebec, right? Howe is supposed to come up from New York City. They're supposed to cut the colonies in half along the Champlain-Hudson corridor, divide them and conquer them, right? But does it work for the British in 1778? Yeah, not to my recollection, right? And do you think it's going to work for the French 20 years earlier?
It never works.
Why not? Why doesn't it work? Well, first and foremost, Montcalm doesn't get all the men he wants. Rather than getting 10,000 men, he only gets like 7,600-ish. Now, of those 7,600-ish men that he has, and we know the exact amount because we actually have the rosters, which is kind of cool, 1,809 of them are Native Americans from 32 separate tribes, with some of them coming as far away as modern-day Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Yeah. Quite literally canoeing thousands of miles to get here, right? We'll come back to this, if you know what I'm saying. Now, with these 32 different tribes, do you think they all speak a common language, can readily communicate? Of course not, right? They speak like 45 separate languages / dialects, and I love this. Remember, there are 1,809 of them. The French provide them with 12 translators. Yeah, do you think something's going to get lost in translation here? Yeah, this might come into play later on in the story, of course, right? Now, Montcalm, unlike Dieskau, also has brought with him, take a wild guess. Precisely, cannons. He brings 44 brass and bronze siege cannons, as a matter of fact. Now, why am I mentioning what the cannons are made out of? Well, if anyone here has any knowledge of artillery... What was that?
How much you can use them.
Correct. I was going to say, if you have a knowledge of artillery or just metallurgy in general, brass and bronze are alloys of copper and tin and copper and zinc, respectively. And they're a little bit more durable than the other type of metal that was a bit cheaper that you could also make cannons out of back then.
Cast iron.
Correct, sir, yes. But you probably know this. Cast iron is cheaper for a very good reason because it comes with a complement of flaws, right? Namely, if you cooked in a skillet before, you know what I'm talking about. It gets very, very hot very fast, holds on to that heat for a very long time. It does this very annoying thing when you, get it wet and then expose it to oxygen. It rusts. We'll get back to that part there in a second. Now, rusty cannons. Does that sound like a good idea to you folks? Yeah, not particularly, right? This fort, by contrast, remember, Montcalm has 44 brass and bronze cannons. This fort only has 18 cast iron cannons. They're the oldest in North America at the time, and nearly all of them had been stored underwater the previous 5 years during the winter. Your facial expression says it all, man. I was like, we're off to a great start, right? Now, we also don't have as many men as Montcalm does. Remember, he's got 7,600-ish. We only have about 2,500. Now, 500 of which are redcoats, or British regulars, which you're very familiar with at this point, right? The other 2,000 guys, though, you remember the guys that Johnson had with him at the Battle of Lake George? Those teenagers? Oh, it's those guys again. And do you think they've ever seen a European-style siege before? Nope. So when they see the French arrayed on the far side of the lake, right, in all their lily-white splendor, they are pooping their pants in fear. And of course, they just let rip with these rusty old iron cannons. They're like, come on, boys, fire them off as fast as you can. Don't worry about that OSHA-approved 6-minute cooldown period, right? And they're firing these cannons so quickly that the barrels of the cannons start to glow red hot. How do you think they cool them down?
Water.
Yeah, ice cold water right on top of the hot iron cannons, right? What could go wrong?
Cracking.
What you say? What could go wrong?
Cracking.
Yeah, exactly. It increases the speed of metal fatigue. The cannon cracks, and when you fire a cracked cannon, what happens?
They can't use
The
it.
cannon is supposed to kaboom. It's just got to kaboom that way. In this case, the kaboom goes back into the audience, right? Now, listen closely. Over the course of Montcalm's 6-day siege, which lasts from August 3rd to August 9th of 1757, 11 of the 18 cast iron cannons we have here will effectively detonate on the men firing them, killing some 35 men outright and injuring an additional 44 or 45. Now, of course, by day 6, things are not looking so good, especially seeing as the 5th night of the siege, a French mortar, basically a bomb, flies over the wall next to the northwest bastion, which is getting the brunt of the French attack, lands on the ground, undetonated, and rolls down into the powder magazine, where it then explodes, destroying several 100,000 pounds of powder. The explosion is so substantial, it actually knocks this bastion off of its foundations, right? Obviously, like I said, by day 6, things are not looking so good. Now, I haven't mentioned this guy yet, but for those who've seen Last Mohicans, which seems to be this group right here, you'll probably remember him from the movie, the fort's gallant Scottish commander, right? Lieutenant Colonel George Monroe. Monroe, again, listen closely, finds himself completely surrounded by a French and Native American picket line, right? He knows reinforcements are not coming from Fort Edward because his superior, Jerome Webb, who's stationed at the fort, realizes that if this fort falls, well, who's going to get attacked next? He is, exactly right. He realizes he can't send reinforcements. The powder magazine is completely destroyed. Most of the artillery pieces are scrapped. Well, this isn't exactly a good situation, and you folks probably don't like admitting this, but in a situation like that, what is your only really logistical military option left?
Surrender.
Correct. And that is exactly what Monroe does. And for his part, Montcalm actually offers Monroe fairly favorable terms of surrender, which you probably remember from Last of the Mohicans, right? He says to the garrison here, they can leave with their red uniforms on and their flags flying high, which is not a consideration that's usually afforded a defeated army back then. Furthermore, he also says that the men can leave with their muskets. And you know what? Heck, he'll even throw in a 6-pound field cannon because they did such a bang-up job defending the place, right? But there is one proviso, one caveat, right? The men can't take any gunpowder and they can't take any shot. So even though the men have their muskets, at this point they're just very expensive letter openers, if you know what I'm saying, right? And with those terms and conditions agreed upon, he allows the garrison here to first march to the entrenched camp, which is kind of like a tent city next door. And from there, under armed French escort, they're supposed to march to Fort Edward. And everything seems pretty hunky-dory, right? But there is kind of one glaring issue. There's one sizable group of French allies that's not invited to the negotiation table. And who might that be?
Natives.
Oh yeah, all those Native Americans, of course. And like we established, some of them have come thousands of miles, and they haven't come thousands of miles because they love France. They've come here for...
Resources.
Well, yeah, stuff, exactly, right? What kind of resources, what kind of stuff are they looking for?
War material.
Guns, well, yes, guns, coats.
Yep.
Actually, metal is exactly what they're looking for. That's like the number one, like, or I should say the top tier list is surprisingly mundane things. So cutlery, like forks, knives, and spoons. Believe it or not, the one thing they're after more than anything else is tea kettles. And people are always shocked when they hear this, but I'm like, a tea kettle is a very practical thing. You boil water, you can cook in it effectively, right? You can carry stuff, right? Tea kettles. Oh, but I should also mention, they're also after...
Scalps.
Correct. Now, follow-up question. Let's see if you folks know this. Why are they after scalps?
Because since they're warlike, it helps them with their what do you call it? Manlyhood. They
Does
get,
it?
They're
Does
ranked
it?
up in the manlyhood.
Does it?
I
What are all
believe
wars
so.
fought over again?
Resources.
Yeah, they could just sell the scalps in Montreal for cash.
That too.
How much could you get for a scalp? Well, about £5 sterling. Now, I know you hear that, like, what does that mean, right? Get this. $7,000 to $10,000 per scalp.
Wow.
Yeah, if you get like 3, you're pretty set, if you know what I'm saying, right? Now, I know, it's like everyone's like, oh, it's a warrior's mark of, no, so they can just sell it for cash. It's kind of crazy, right? Now, based on the terms and conditions that Montcalm has just established, are they going to get any of this stuff?
Nope.
No. So you think they're a little bit ticked off? To put it lightly, and for those who have seen Last of the Mohicans, you might remember what happens next as the British garrison marches to Fort Edward. Do you remember what happens?
Yeah, the Native Americans attacked.
Yes, they get attacked. This,
Follow them and keep attacking.
correct. This is the infamous massacre of Fort William Henry, in which some 300 men are killed. Now, note what I said there. I said 300 men. We do not know how many women, how many children, how many Native American allies or slaves were killed because Britain doesn't think they're important enough to be kept on the rosters. So the toll is not exactly surprising if you know British mentality back then. But as the survivors trickle into Fort Edward over the next 4 days, the New York Gazette, which they've replaced with the TV, it used to be over there, sorry, gets a hold of the story first, and they kind of blow it out of proportion. They say something to the effect of, thousands upon thousands are slaughtered by Montcalm and his savage allies at Fort William Henry. And this acts very similarly, if you know your American history, to later cries of like, remember the Alamo, remember the Maine. These are, of course, are American defeats or disasters that are spun by the press to increase recruitment. And guess what? Same thing applies here. Yeah, and it does work, yes. In certain places in the 13 colonies, recruitment increases by 3 times. And that's not insignificant, if you know what I'm saying. It's weird that the fall of this fort is kind of the swift kick in the butt that Britain needs to get its act together, and over the next 2 years, ultimately, win the French and Indian War. They first take Ticonderoga in 1759 after 2 attempts, right? They then take Quebec. Later that year, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which some of you have probably heard of, where Montcalm and Wolfe, the 2 generals, die on opposite sides of the battlefield very romantically, right? And then the following year, they capture Montreal, and again, with these forts and cities having been captured or capitulated, well, it looks like the whole of the North American continent is going to fall into Britain's hands, except for that pesky part in the west that's controlled by Spain. You know, that's a story for another time, of course, right? Now, even though Britain finds itself victorious in the French and Indian War / the 7 Years' War, it does find itself in quite a bit of debt. And if you're a country in debt, how do you get out of debt, folks?
Taxes.
Oh, taxes and they start taxing the colonies on everything from sugar to paper to tea, and kicking the can down the road a little bit. This leads to the cry of no taxation without representation, and leads to a little old conflict known as the Revolutionary War, of course, right? Now, that is what happens on a macroscopic scale in terms of history, if you know what I'm saying, U.S. history. But what happens to the fort after Montcalm captures it? Just as a little finale, if you know what I'm saying, right?
He sets it on
Now,
fire.
what was that?
He sets it on fire.
Well, we'll get there. but Montcalm basically realizes, first and foremost, that he's taken 6 days to besiege this fort. How long did he want to take initially? Just 2, so he's a bit behind schedule, right? And he knows he doesn't have the resources to push forward towards Albany or even Fort Edward, because his men have to get back to Quebec in time for the harvest, because they are still contending with a famine, right? He basically sends the bulk of his men back. He stays here until August 14th, so his men can harvest our gardens, so they have a little bit of food. And then on August 14th, the morning of, he looks at the fort, he takes a deep whiff of it in through his nose, and he goes, "Ugh, c'est dégoûtant. Brûlez!" Which means?
Burn it.
Burn it. And the French burned the fort to the ground. Montcalm said he could smell the fort from 3 miles away, which I think is a very strong testament of the quality of the lives that the men here had, right? Now, the fort effectively is an ash heap for the next 2 centuries, 200 years, until 1953, when a series of archaeologists and investors will excavate the side of the fort and reconstruct it based on the original blueprints which they found in the Royal Archives in London. Because, you know, British people, they love throwing things away, right? And that, folks, is what you are sitting in right now, listening to my ramblings. And congratulations, everyone. You made it through the entire middle school history portion. Well done. But